The latest poll from the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab asked Florida residents about the state's affordability crisis, ICE crackdowns, and who they want for their next U.S. Senator. Here to tell us about it is Sean Frieder, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of North Florida and Director of the school's Public Opinion Research Lab. Sean, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
So the upshot here, I believe you said, is that it's clear that Republicans still enjoy an advantage in Florida, but it may not be as strong as previous years. Explain to us what the data show you that tell you that.
So first looking at head-to-heads in the gubernatorial matchups and also the Senate matchups, we asked about Byron Donalds, who's in our previous poll the leading candidate on the Republican side to make it through their primary, and head-to-heads against the two Democrats there. And then we asked the same thing for Moody, the leading Republican, to come out of that primary.
Ashley Moody.
Yes, and the two Democrats there. And we found that the Republicans in both cases have about a 6 or 7 point lead over the Democrats. Now, that's a meaningful lead, but at the same time, that's not the seismic leads that we've seen in previous years. This is not a 15 or 20 point victory that we're looking at. We're looking more at high single digits. So that's maybe something that you would expect, one, in a midterm year. Midterm years for the party of the current president are usually much tougher than other types of elections. That's also probably somewhat a reflection of Trump's numbers generally, what's been going on in various policy areas. So combination of substantive things going on that kind of affect down ballot issues, but also just it's a tough environment for Republicans, just as it would have been for Democrats back in 22.
In terms of Trump's numbers here, President Trump had a 45% favorability, 48% unfavorable. But when his name was thrown into the mix in terms of who people support for governor, he really had an impact. You mentioned that you did a head-to-head kind of comparison about how Byron Donalds might fare in the gubernatorial race or how Casey DeSantis might fare. What happened when you told potential voters that Byron Donalds has Trump's endorsement?
Yeah, endorsements matter, especially in primary races. So if you don't mention to voters that there's an endorsement out there, Donalds is endorsed by Trump. We put DeSantis, Casey DeSantis, who's not announced that she's going to run. That's speculative, but we put her, she's otherwise been in the front-runner conversation, up against Donalds. If you don't mention the endorsements, she's got about a 4-point disadvantage to Donalds. It's a pretty close race. You mention that Donalds has the endorsement, it becomes a blowout. She's down by about 35 points in that case. So
Wow.
endorsements make a huge difference. That makes it hard for her potentially to catch up because the other big endorsement potentially sitting out there would be Governor DeSantis' endorsement. Now, her being his wife, you would imagine that she would have the tacit endorsement. That would be an awkward conversation if she didn't get that. So with endorsement versus endorsement, Donalds has a pretty big advantage.
Yeah, your poll shows that DeSantis has fewer unfavorables than the president. He had a 52% favorable, 42% unfavorable. But you note that in the Trump favorability ratings that 57% of independents were in the unfavorable category. What does that tell you about positioning for congressional races in the midterms?
Yeah, independents in the state of Florida, this also looks similar to national numbers that we've seen elsewhere. They are frustrated right now. We see generally, if we look at net approvals, independents are down maybe negative 20, 25 on Trump on related issues. We asked a lot of questions related to immigration. If you mention Trump's name, that sort of insulates a little bit of their frustration. But if you just talk about ICE, if you talk about some of the things that have been going on recently, again, independents really frustrated. And when people go to vote, they often have national issues at top of mind, even if we're talking about Florida-centric races. So this is something that if I was in a House race, a Senate race, I would be really worried about what independents are thinking right now about national level issues.
And we did touch on the Senate race for U.S. Senate, which is Ashley Moody, who was appointed by the governor to the vacant seat that was left behind when Marco Rubio moved to work in the cabinet. So that is a special election, and she will face a couple of Democrats, both of whom are, have some name recognition, but not necessarily enormous name recognition. One of them is Alexander Vindman, who is our lieutenant colonel, and he was also a whistleblower in the Trump impeachment case that had to do with Trump's call to Volodymyr Zelensky back in 2019. And then Angie Nixon, who is a local House rep, and she served since 2020. What does your polling show in terms of how either of them fare against essentially the incumbent, Ashley Moody.
So at least at this stage of the race, there's not a huge difference or really any statistically detectable difference between their abilities to beat one of the Republican candidates. They do about as well as each other. There is some extra information that we find pretty interesting in there, which is just looking at name recognition. Pretty much when people vote in primaries, they lose the one thing they usually vote based off of, which is partisanship. So they go to the next thing, which is, have I heard this person before? Does this person seem familiar to me? Vindman's big advantage, theoretically, is that he's made national news in the past. As you mentioned, he was involved with Trump's first impeachment. He was the whistleblower in that case. So you would imagine that he would have a huge name recognition advantage over Nixon, who might be well known in Northeast Florida, but maybe not statewide. Instead, he's just got an advantage of about 8 points. So that's still also 8 points where most people are saying they don't know who Vindman is. Now, this is before campaign advertisements start going out and he starts being able to really press that advantage. But I guess if I was part of the Vindman campaign, I would be somewhat disappointed to learn that memories are short. People don't seem to be able to connect that name to what happened several years ago.
You mentioned enforcement when it comes to immigration issues, and the state, as reflected in this poll, is pretty well split. 49% disapproving of this administration's handling of immigration, 48% approving of it.
Now, if you just go and change one thing, which is instead of asking about Trump's handling, you talk about the specifics, such as ICE's handling of immigration. And substantively, there's not a functional difference between those two things. As soon as Trump's name is taken out, a lot more people express disapproval.
Mm.
ICE, their handling is about -15. We ask a question about, would you be supportive or oppositional to bringing more facilities for detaining immigrants into Florida? That's even less popular at -18. So also in that, if you look at strong approval versus strong disapproval, there's a lot of strong opinions on this, but the strength is particularly on the strong disapproval side. The people that are unhappy are very unhappy about this.
Oh, interesting. There are some issues that showed broad support, I thought was interesting in such a hyper partisan time. You asked people about AI, you asked people about recall elections, and you asked people about guns. What were you finding in terms of how people are feeling about issues pertinent to those?
Yeah, I'll take recall and guns first. On those two, there's a pretty straightforward story. We asked if people would support the ability at the statewide level to recall people if they are failing in their job before the next election.
Elected officials.
Elected officials, overwhelming support for that across the board, no partisan differences.
And explain to us, currently, you can recall at the local
At the
level.
local level, but no provision exists at the statewide level.
Okay.
And then when we talk about gun prohibition, specifically, we're asking about prohibiting firearms at protests and demonstrations. Again, across the board support there, about 2/3 of Floridian support, but no real difference between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Somewhat in line with often when we ask questions about specific policies, Republicans look a lot more positive than we ask more general questions. But I think this also has to do a lot with high profile assassinations and attempted assassinations at protests and demonstrations, which might have brought everyone a little bit more in line. The question of AI is particularly fascinating because, on one hand, there is a broad across-the-board support for AI regulation. One of the pieces of legislation running through the legislature right now would do things like require disclosure if you're talking to AI, some protections for children. So, again, overwhelming across-the-board support. But the really interesting thing there is asking people just about how they feel about AI generally, not policy-related, just their attitudes. And we're seeing for the first time that I've been looking at this, a real partisan divide on this. Democrats about net -25. They're very skeptical right now of the rollout of AI. Republicans in the opposite direction, about +15, positive about the rollout of AI. And this is a partisan divide I wasn't seeing in these numbers even as recently as a year ago.
How about marijuana? We know that that ballot initiative to make recreational marijuana failed in the last election cycle, but it was very close. The threshold in Florida for a ballot initiative to pass is 60%. And you found overall support for legalizing it at more than 60%.
That's correct. Yeah, 60 plus. I think 66% or so. So again, this is similar to what we saw the last time this was on the ballot. I've been fooled to a certain extent before and won't get fooled easily again. So numbers are high right now before campaigning starts. And then what we saw last time was that Governor DeSantis put quite a bit of money into an anti-marijuana campaign in the couple months leading up to the vote. That 66% we saw before trickled down slowly, and dropped right below 60% just as voting started. So the measure failed. You can imagine a similar thing happening if there is a similarly sized expenditure campaign on this.
So speaking of ballot initiatives, taxes is expected to be coming before voters at some point. There may be a special session to discuss what to put on the ballot for voters in terms of getting rid of property taxes or cutting property taxes or changing how their people are taxed. What are you finding in terms of support for those kinds of initiatives?
Yeah, so we use some ballot initiative language looking at phase out for the homestead taxes. And what we found was that's going to be right on the tipping point or so, about the 60% threshold that's needed for it to pass. We found the numbers currently sitting at about 56%. Republicans fairly supportive of this. It's a tax cut. 75%. Democrats deeply skeptical. It's something that goes to fund a lot of state and local services, so their support's at 25%. Independents, as they often do, are probably going to be the deciding factor here. They're right at 56%. So this is hovering just below the threshold level. This is going to be probably right on the edge of passage when we get to November.
Well, Sean Frieder, it is a fascinating early look at how this election season might roll out. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Absolutely.
And we'll have a link to those poll results on our website if you'd like to check them out.